Hey there and welcome to the channel. You're watching The Light in My Library. No, my face didn't change. You're going crazy. I definitely didn't shave or anything. Today, we're going to be discussing chapters 5, 10 through 15 in our continuing reread of the Alloy of Law as we prepare for the release of The Lost Metal in November. So, just like last week, we're going to start out with a quick summary of the chapters that we read, and then we're going to go over some of my thoughts of what happened, and we'll go from there. So, here in chapter 10, starting off, we get our first POV from Miles 100 Lives, or Miles Dogetter. I've never really been able to figure out how to say his last name. So here we have Miles' first POV, and he is in the Vanisher's new hideout. He looks around the hideout, thinks about its equipment and all that for a little while, and then he goes into a room, and we get our first introduction to Mr. Suit. For those of you who remember the reveal of who this character is, they are important later on, but here, the only relevance is that they seem to be Miles' boss. There's some plot establishment here, setting up Miles' motivations. We then cut to Wax and Wayne and Maurice, and Wax kind of gives Maurice more details about who Miles is. And it turns out he's a twin-born blood maker and whatever the... You know what, I have the chart right here. Twin-born blood maker and Arger. So he can compound gold to have a limitless ferrochemical supply of health, which is a particularly deadly combination. We also find out that Miles was sort of friends, more team player with Wax out in the Roughs. He was from a city that's like 250 miles away from where Wax was set up. Moving on to the next chapter, chapter 11, we see Wax and Wayne and Maurice get off a carriage out onto the location where the last Vanisher train robbery was. Wayne here has a conversation with Maurice about Wax and kind of hints at her that he thinks that she should pursue Wax. And then they find a weird, flat, rectangular imprint in the soil. Also, important plot point here is that all of the Vanisher train robberies have happened close by at a place where the railroad and the canal system are particularly close. We end out the chapter with a scene of Wax back on the train, heading back to L&L, coming back from the bathroom on the train, when he gets shot at and attacked by Miles. Oh, I guess I did miss in the summary of Chapter 10 that Mr. Suit, or Miles says to Mr. Suit that it's time for him to go kill Wax to take him out. Moving on to Chapter 12, the whole chapter here is pretty much just a fight between Miles and Wax. They climb up on top of the train, and Wax, flies around above him as the train continues at high speeds. And eventually he is able to, after taking a grazing bullet wound and shooting Miles in the eye and the hand and all over the place several times, doing basically no damage, eventually Wax is able to shove Miles off of the train. The train continues on down the tracks, and they make it to safety, where it turns out Miles had jammed the lock shut on the train car that Wayne and Maurice were in, and Wax gets his medical attention, and then they head back to the city, where, moving on to chapter 13, so we get our first introduction here to Renette, who Wayne has a massive crush on, which is just totally unreciprocated. She greets them very gruffly at the door, and after Wayne bargains to give her one of the aluminum guns that they picked up at the wedding, Renette agrees to let them in, and they come in. Here we switch to Maurice's perspective. So after some back and forth banter, Renette finally agrees to give Wax his new gun, Vindication, which actually happens to be, even though it's definitely a gun that could exist in the real world, it is my hands down favorite fantasy gun of all time. No questions asked. It definitely beats out the other prominent example from books that I've read would be the Blinding Knife in the Lightbringer saga. That's the only one that I can think of right now. But I think Vindication, not only is the name 10 times cooler, but the context that comes with that name, and also just the fact that I really like both of those two things. I'm not going to lie, I'm a sucker for Vin and anything that makes reference to Vin, and Vindication is my favorite fantasy gun of all time. That's enough opinion in the summary section, though. So we move on to the next chapter where we get another POV from Miles, talking again to Mr. Suit, and they kind of argue back and forth as to whether or not Miles intentionally let Wax get away, which of course we know he did not. He was trying to kill Wax. But Mr. Suit doesn't quite believe him. They have a discussion back and forth about how they are going to do one last heist, and then the Vanishers are going to go to ground for 6 months, and Mr. Suit is going to be leaving the city that night. And then we cut back to either Maurice or Wax's perspective, I can't remember, but it's Wax's perspective. They have a conversation in one of the upper rooms of Renette's house where Wax is doing his planning, basically laying out here that Wax has a plan. Brandon does not tip his hand all the way to what that plan is going to be, though. He shows Maurice the plan, and they have a brief conversation where Maurice kind of makes a pass at him here, and he just ignores it, kind of shuts her down a little bit, which is leading into, down the road, I'm going to talk about how Maurice and Wax ends up being one of my favorite male-female friendships in all of fantasy science fiction. But yeah, that's our summary of chapters 10 through 15, so I'm just going to go through some of my thoughts real fast, starting out back with chapter 10. So, back in chapter 11, we get the first POV from Miles, and I'm maybe a little bit too fixated on it, but one of the things that I wanted to theorize a little bit about was, we know, so Miles has a lighter that he carries on him that is specifically pointed out to be silver. Now, silver, if I remember correctly, can be pushed on allomantically. It is not allomantically reactive, as in, like, it does not burn for anything. But I'm pretty sure you can still push on it. Push and pull on it with steel and iron. However, we do also know that silver has some unique realmatic properties in the Cosmere. Realmatic, of course, being a word that basically means whatever we want it to mean when discussing the Cosmere. There's not a super hard definition. It's basically the study of magic as if it were physics in the Cosmere. We call that realmatics. Long short of it is, we know that there are some deeper realmatic properties to silver in the Cosmere, and Miles specifically thinks about how his lighter that he keeps in his vest is silver, and so it makes me wonder if maybe there's some significance, because we know that Miles is being probably influenced by an extraterrestrial entity, and that silver might be a way in which he's being influenced by them. I don't really know, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but again, this is probably something that I'm just too hyperfixated on, but I do wonder about that. I wonder anytime silver is specifically mentioned by name in any Cosmere novel, so I do also want to say that Miles' POV here does actually feel a little bit too convenient because, and I don't know if I can express this properly, but Mr. Suit we haven't met. We have had no indication. The character has been foreshadowed in other ways, but we've had no direct indication that his character exists. However, everyone else that Miles interacts with, we have already heard of by name, and we already know their job in the Vanishers operation. And so it feels as if maybe it's a little bit overbuilt in preparing for Miles's POV. And that could just be my take on it, but it just comes off as too convenient to me. Not really in a bad way. One of the problems that I run into a lot when discussing Brandon Sanderson is that I've read his books so many times that it's hard for me to not nitpick, if that makes sense. Also, I do like it was properly foreshadowed that Marisi was an Allomancer, but I also like the specific setup here of it's kind of a Chekhov's gun situation where she's like, well, my power's useless, and we know from the end of the book that it's not. It should probably be stated, I don't give spoiler warnings for these videos because this is specifically a reread of Alloy of Law. If you're watching these videos, I assume that you have already read this book. I'm not giving spoilers for the next book in the series, but I've just this whole time been giving full spoilers for the full book in all 3 of these videos so far because this is a reread series, not a first read series. Moving on to the next chapter, I don't super have a lot to say about it. I think there's some nice character work with Marisi and Wayne kind of starting to develop a relationship here, friendship. Also, the hat subplot makes an appearance again here, which is an endless source of amusement for me and a lot of other fans. And then, yeah, there's just a lot of clues in plot here in this chapter. In the next chapter, which would be chapter 13, chapter 13, I do like that there's a moment in the fight where Wax is caught totally off guard by something Miles does because he's used to fighting somebody who can die, and Miles fights like somebody who cannot die, and so it throws him off and he makes some mistakes. And then almost immediately afterwards, he turns around and does the exact sort of thing to Miles, where Miles is expecting, to be able to pull in towards him and whatnot, and is not used to fighting somebody with, what is his ferrochemical ability? Skimmer? He's not used to fighting a skimmer, and Wax dumps all of his weight in, or pulls out all of his weight, and throws Miles off balance in a way that he's not used to having to anticipate. And I just like that kind of turn and turnabout that's going on here, where Wax is like, whoa, yeah, then I'll just do the same thing to you. I'll throw you off. It was a really nice character beat, in my opinion, and something that isn't honestly a lot of attention drawn to, but it does feel intentional. Also, the part of this fight where Miles pulls out his knife and then Wax goes to push on it and Miles just shoves it into his arm so that he can't and gets ready to bare-knuckle box, but the knife is right there. It's bloody and it's awesome, and it's one of my favorite images from this book. Also, there is a quote here that I wanted to bring direct attention to that it just struck me as a very nice piece of writing. And the quote, Wax is talking to Marisi as he has his shirt off to get medical attention, and she comes in and she helps him with his wound, and then he goes to put his shirt on and she says, well, I'll turn around so you can change. And he's like, really? You just saw me half naked, you're turning around so that I can put clothes on? And she gets all embarrassed, and he says to her, there are much worse things than to be genuine. And it just struck me as a really good quote, and it's probably one that I'm going to put on my Instagram here this week. So that's a plug for my Instagram. You can follow me at Delight My Library on Instagram and Twitter. Anyways, moving on. So into chapter 14, I already talked it a little bit. I couldn't stop myself from talking about how Vindication is just my favorite fantasy gun ever. But I do really like Renette as a character, and I particularly like the practical approach that she takes to her elementic powers. I feel like maybe in some ways the scenes with Renette here in this book were intended to show the reader. I don't. This is kind of hard to explain because in Mistborn Era 1, we always had the perspective of a Mistborn, whether it was Kelsier, Vin, or later Elend. We always had the perspective of a Mistborn who could both push and pull. And in this book, of course, our main character is a coin shot and can only push. And as you read this book, it kind of seems like, well, a coin shot can do basically everything that a Mistborn could do as far as flying around goes. And it kind of, for a while, makes it seem as though iron pulling is a significantly weaker power than steel pushing is. And I feel like this Renette scene is in here specifically to show the kind of innovative thinking and usefulness that can be taken advantage of by a lurcher when they, you might have to be a little bit more creative with your powers, but a lurcher can be just as useful. Lurching can be just as useful as a power as coin shots, and I feel like that was what Brandon was going for with this scene. But also, Renette as a character is awesome. One of my favorite characters. I feel like I say that about everybody, but Renette is one of my favorite characters. And I really like the way that she just comes out with a gun ready to shoot them. And just all the little snippy comments in this chapter where Wax is like, well, she's never shot anybody once she's let them in the door before. I just really like all the interactions here. And then moving on to the last chapter, I do like that here we have a little bit of a callback and also more foreshadowing as to who Mr. Suit is, with Miles thinking about, well, I know what his train schedule is. I've been keeping track of it. And if you're paying attention, you'll remember that they found a list of numbers inside of Miles's cigar box, and that, of course, is the train schedule. Also here, later in this chapter, during the conversation between Wax and Marisi, I really do enjoy the character work that's done here, and the kind of like the moment that Wax thinks to himself, no, I'm not going to pursue Marisi. Yes, I'm attracted to her. Yes, I'm interested in her, but I specifically am deciding not to pursue her. And I also really like, slight spoilers for the future books in the series, but I really like that Brandon Sanderson sticks to this decision. Because in most books, what you would expect is that they would do like a will they, won't they, and the slow build up, and eventually it would blossom into a romance. And I really like, especially because I definitely like Steris more than Marisi, but I really love that Brandon Sanderson sticks to this judgment call, and that Marisi is his friend from basically this point forward. And I remember being disappointed when I read this first book, when this was the only book out. But it was definitely the right call to make, not only for the characters, but for the series as a whole. And so, I like that moment. I like the whole conversation that they have is a lot of really solid character work, and really appreciated it as far as developing their friendship further goes. So yeah, that's the recap for today. Next week we will be reading chapters 16 through 20 plus the epilogue, if I remember. Maybe there's a chapter 21, I'm not sure. But that's what we're going to be reading next week. Also, if you haven't noticed, I'm just going to point it out now, I will be talking about the broadsheets probably at the very end of the next video recap. I don't know if it's even in frame here. I'll try to get a shot of it. But I actually have one of the full-sized print broadsheets for Alloy of Law right up there on the wall that they gave out at the midnight release of the book. So I'm going to be talking about that as a whole, as a piece of art, separate and obviously related to the book, at the end of next week's recap. Or I might do it in the review video. But I hadn't forgotten about them, I just was skipping over them to talk about all at once. Other than that, you can find me, I mentioned already, on Instagram and Twitter. You can also find me on Twitch at The Light in My Man Cave, where I stream theoretically every Tuesday or Wednesday and Thursday, but not really. I've been doing really terrible about streaming recently. But I do live streams over there, so if you head over there and give me a follow, you'll get a notification when we go live. And other than that, if you enjoyed this video, if you like this content, please do consider liking and leaving a comment and subscribing. All of those things really help to get visibility on this channel and to help spread the word about it. And I would really like to, if you're reading along with me, please do leave comments and let me know what you think of the chapters each week. I would really appreciate that. And I will see you guys next time.